Okay, so first question. Do you work with students who may have like mental health issues or such as depression?
Absolutely. That's one interesting part of doing this job. Since I started in guidance, we're finding that that's become a more frequent aspect of what we do. Obviously, a big part of guidance's role is to provide academic support and help you figure out your pathways and things like that. But what we are discovering and having to deal with on a much more regular basis is students with some pretty significant mental health challenges. Whether it's anxiety, depression, addiction issues, and things like that. But definitely it's becoming more common.
Okay, so the second question is, do you think there think some common reasons why students become depressed or suicidal?
So what do you think are some common reasons why students may become depressed or suicidal?
Oh, there's a pretty long list of reasons why, and it can be very
common.
Yeah.
probably some of the most common ones that we find. It can be that there's a history of mental health issues in the family. So in some cases that might be a situation that's going on. It can be in some cases too, and you guys would know this, there's a lot more pressure put on students from an early age in terms of being able to perform academically. Set goals for yourself that may be really, really difficult to achieve. So a lot of that pressure on students can make things that much more significantly challenging. What we're finding a lot is that students are coming into high school with a lot less resiliency. That's a big word that we do focus on, and that means a student's ability to bounce back when bad things happen. So for instance, you get a really bad mark on a test, or your boyfriend, girlfriend breaks up with you or something like that. Having the ability to be able to sort of bounce back and feel like things are back to normal is a healthy way of dealing with situations. But what can often happen is students don't have that quick ability to rebound. And then things tend to pile up and they get worse and worse and they don't know how to cope. So there's a great deal of pressure. And again, part of tied into that is the amount of anxiety that we're seeing students coming in. Not only how many students identify with having anxiety when they come in grade 9, but the severity of it as well. So there's a lot of social pressure as well. We've had students comment on the fact that social media can be a big piece of it, where you don't really feel like you can disconnect from things that are going on. And you oftentimes find that you end up comparing yourself to others. Like you look at Facebook and Instagram and stuff, everybody's always putting their best of on social media. So if you're looking at that and thinking that, well, that's what my life should be like, sometimes it's an unrealistic expectation, and that can really create a lot of stress for students as well, because you just don't feel as though your life is as good as somebody else's. So social media, pressure, family history, a whole lot of different factors can play into it.
Okay. So how would you help a student overcome some of the problems that you mentioned?
Well, for us as a school, one of the important things we always say up front is we're not therapy. We're not here to be the go-to person to help a student work through really significant mental health issues, but we're a part of it. We want to make sure that we're providing a lot of support, and that can be in some cases helping students get in contact with the correct resources out in the community, whether it's, say, it could be a psychologist, a psychiatrist, their family doctor. We also want to make sure that the students' parents are actively involved in helping provide support as well. Just as an example, if we were to have a student that came down here who was expressing some thoughts of self-harm or what have you, or having a real mental health distress situation, typically what we'll do is we'll involve our social worker, who is more or less our frontline person to deal with those really significant mental health issues. Vice principal oftentimes is involved as well. We want to make sure that the parents are contacted. Really what we do is we tend to rally a lot of supports around a student to help look out for them if they're having a really distressed situation. We actually do have a very formal protocol in place. So if a student was having some suicidal thoughts, we actually have a very formal process that we as a school are required to follow to make sure we do a check-in to see just, are they at a real significant threat to themselves? What type of steps need to be taken to ensure that that student is safe and gets some help afterwards.
So how do you think we as a community can prevent teen suicide?
Prevention is a tough thing. I think one of the things that I've noticed as a real change is it's become more socially acceptable to talk about it. In the past, it was one of those things that tended to People didn't want to discuss because there was this idea that, well, if you talk about teen suicide, it's going to make students consider taking steps towards it. Whereas I don't think that's really the case. I think it's become more socially acceptable to address mental health issues and try and get students help. In the past, I think it was a lot of students would try to keep these things to themselves because they were embarrassed or they were ashamed or didn't want to be singled out for having some mental health challenges. There's more of an awareness that this needs to be addressed. If you look at things like the Let's Talk Day that Bell Canada does and things like that, it's become much more acceptable and widespread that we want to draw attention to it, and it is something that needs to be supported. I think making sure that parents understand that there are a lot of supports out there that can be used so you can intervene before things get to a real severe crisis standpoint. I think that's important. From our end of things, I think there's more training to be provided for staff so that we can be aware of the type of things that, like if we spot warning signs and things like that, that we can intervene early. Making students aware of things to watch for, so that if, for instance, you notice something in a friend of yours, a real change in behavior that was really concerning, what could you do? And interestingly, that's one of the ways that we often find out that a student is in real distress is one of their friends comes down and lets us know, simply out of pure worry for their well-being. So in terms of prevention, I think it's making sure that people are comfortable talking about it, knowing where they can go to find information and support, so that you're not in a situation where you're ever having to deal with it on your own. There's lots of different avenues for getting help, so that student who may be in that high level of crisis does have the ability to get the help they need.
What are some signs or red flags that we might be able to see in a student who may be suicidal without them telling anyone?
Some of the real telltale signs that I know we've been told to watch for are things like real change in social conduct, where you might notice somebody giving possessions away, or distancing themselves, like stopping doing activities that they used to really, really enjoy, separating themselves from their social group. Real dramatic changes in that regard can be a bit of a warning sign that there's something not quite right. Even when somebody is using language where, sometimes people throw around things like, "Oh, I'm gonna kill myself," or they use it in kind of a really flippant way and they don't mean it. And those are the type of situations where generally if it's used in a really off-the-cuff kind of a way, you know that it isn't serious. But if you have somebody that uses language that kind of suggests that they might be, they're sort of saying farewells, or they're talking a little bit more seriously about harming themselves in some way, those are the type of things that you definitely want to take very seriously. If they're using language about, things are hopeless, things look really bleak, I don't really have much to live for, I'm just a burden on other people. When you hear that type of language being used as well, that's something that you want to be worried about. And it's always a good idea. I tell students, if you've ever had a situation like that, make sure you tell an adult, somebody who that you can trust. Sometimes for us too, we want to make sure that you guys understand there's a bit of a reluctance sometimes to come forward and let an adult know that your friend or somebody that you're aware of has been using this kind of language, because you think, oh, they're going to be so mad at me if I tell somebody. My attitude always is, would you not rather have a short-term friend be really angry with you than no friend? You think about it that way. If you could be one of those people to help intervene in something before it gets really, really bad, wouldn't you want to be the person that took that step? So, hope that answered that question. I'm not too sure if I covered it completely, but
that's fine.
Okay.
All right. So, do you think there's a difference between the signs and reasons behind teen suicide and adult suicide?
I think sometimes with teenagers, again, the different types of social pressures that you're under can influence your decisions, and sometimes it can be a very rash decision. I remember once hearing somebody use a phrase, suicide is a permanent solution to a temporary problem. And sometimes when you're a teenager, something that to you might seem like it's world-ending, when you get older and you look back on it, you think, wow, I can't believe I got so upset about something that really in hindsight wasn't that big a deal. But because of some of the pressures that you're under as a young person, you haven't necessarily developed some of the emotional wherewithal, the emotional strength to be able to work through some of those types of things. As you get older, the hope is that you develop more resiliency so you can cope better with when bad life events occur and challenges happen that you have to try and overcome. I think for adults, in some cases, it can be a situation where it's been a real long-standing mental health issue. the hope is that maybe they've tried various treatment options, they've looked at different ways to try and get support, and unfortunately it gets to the point where they feel like they've exhausted everything. So typically I think when you find with adult suicide rates, you're going to see that is more, there's probably a long-standing history of mental health. It's not usually something that they sort of make a rash judgment on, whereas with teens I think you're going to find that in some cases it could be you've had a series of really kind of nasty setbacks or personal mishaps, couple that with maybe a bit of depression or anxiety or other things that might be going on behind the scenes, and it can be I think more of a snap and emotional reaction that can sometimes occur. That's not to say that there couldn't already be some long-standing mental health issues with a young person as well that would factor into it, but I do think the circumstances are generally quite different.
Okay, so do you think people react and cope differently to teen suicides and adult suicides? And if they do you think that they should?
That's a hard question. I think definitely there's when it comes to a teen suicide, I think a lot of times there's a great deal of frustration and questioning that goes on because people feel as though, was there something else that could have been done to help that student? Or the interesting thing is when teen suicides are concerned, there are so many different pieces at work to kind of look out for a student or a teenager that the hope is that the intervention strategies happen quicker. So if something were to occur where a teen did take their own life, I think a lot of people would wonder, well, how did we not catch that sooner? Could there not have been some steps taken to help prevent that from happening in the first place? So I think there's a lot of questioning that goes on, maybe a lot of guilt. I think when it occurs, when you get to adulthood, oftentimes there's a lot of frustration over wondering, what kind of factors played into it. And it's so unique from case to case in terms of the reasoning behind why it might have occurred. Again, as I mentioned earlier, when you're an adult, the hope is again that you've got that emotional awareness to maybe be able to more constructively work through stuff in a healthy way, or at least reach out and get some support if you've got the ability to do so. So I think there's definitely a lot more social guilt, confusion that happens when a teenager takes their own life. Simply because there's, I think, a lot of questions about what could have been done to stop this. It's such a tragedy to lose somebody at such a young age. But suicide in any capacity is a tragedy. You don't want somebody to get to that point where they're so low that they feel that the only solution to what they're feeling is to end it. There's always ways to try and look for help and get some support. The hard part sometimes is convincing people to reach out and get it.
Alright, so this is our last question. Do you think reasons for suicide differ in different environments, such as different countries and cultures?
Oh, for sure. If you think about, so focusing specifically on Canada, or even if you wanted to get even really narrow down to even just our school community, SGM is a school that has a reputation for being a very high achieving academic school. That sometimes brings some pressures along with it in terms of how students feel they have to work to keep up with their classmates and things. So that can be a bit of a unique situation if you compare what happens in a school environment like this, or even carry that forward into, say, students in university and college where they've got all the academic pressures on their shoulders as well. That's a very, very different environment, and the different reasons that might prompt a student to commit suicide could be very different than, say, somebody who is living in a third world country where you're more worried about, where's your next meal coming from, or are you going to have a secure roof over your head, or if I go out and walk the streets at night, am I putting myself in jeopardy? Those types of things are very, very different circumstances, and you might be in a situation where, for students here, you might have somebody who's worried that they're not maintaining a 95% average versus somebody who in a different country might be worried about whether or not they're going to have a roof over their head tomorrow. So the circumstances like that can be drastically different. When it comes to statistics, I'm definitely no expert in terms of comparing how what suicide rates in Canada look like compared to another country in the world, but you can assume that depending on the cultural environment, things like that, it's going to be quite different. So,
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Did we cover everything okay?
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're very welcome, guys. Well, when's your project due?